This video is for students who are looking for modeling of steps 4 and 5 of the Turning Points tool, which we can see here are for assessing the historical significance of the change and then determining whether or not it can truly be considered a turning point. The ability to assess an event and determine if it is a turning point is a very involved process that requires a lot of information gathering, critical thinking, and evaluation. Also, just so you're aware, part of the summative assessment at the end of this unit does require you to identify and explain a turning point, as well as a relationship between a pair of documents. Therefore, this is a pretty important skill for you to develop, and instead of trying to squeeze all this into a video or two, there will be one video for each of the main parts. This is the fourth and final video in this series, and as I mentioned earlier, it will focus solely on the last two steps of this process. The modeling that I do in this video will be utilizing resources from Day 8 of Unit 1, which focuses on how did the expansion of English settlement in North America lead to a significant turning point in United States history. However, this tool can be applied to other content, so if you are evaluating another event as a potential turning point, you can still follow along as I go through the process. Before we begin, I'm just going to pull up the paper version of the Turning Points tool one more time, just so we can remind ourselves of two really important things. First, when determining whether an event is actually a turning point, it must be historically significant. And second, the changes that it results in must be greater than the patterns and trends that remain the same, which we call continuity. Steps 1 through 3 were all about us establishing the historical context, identifying the defining characteristics of the proposed event, and determining various elements we should consider when thinking about continuity and change. Steps 4 and 5 are where we finally get to apply everything we've worked on and make our determination. The first thing we're going to do in step 4 is determine whether the event was historically significant. And to help us through this process are these guiding questions that I'm going to go through in more detail in just a few moments. Then, let's say that after all of this work on this page does in fact lead us to believe it is historically significant. The final step is to consider whether the change is greater than the continuity, which is what's going to happen here in step 5. Remember, both of these requirements must be present for the event to truly be a turning point. For convenience, I'm going to flip back to the electronic version of this step as it appears in the slides for Day 8. And here, you can see the event I mentioned earlier that we're going to be working towards evaluating as a turning point, the displacement of indigenous people due to the expansion of European settlement. If you've been completing this Turning Points tool over the span of several lessons, you definitely will be referring back to what you've done in steps 1 through 3, and you're probably going to also be using some of the sources that you used, so make sure you have access to both of them before moving further. As we begin step 4, the guiding questions that you see here that are meant to help you assess its historical significance, they're very generic, and it is up to us to make them applicable to the specific event we're considering. I'm now going to model some things that you might want to be thinking about in order to do this. I'm going to go through each of these categories individually, and seeing as how these might provide you with some ideas and how you can apply them to a different event that you might be evaluating, you might want to pause this video at any point so you can get a better look at them. First, when I'm thinking about the importance and whether or not the proposed turning point was important to people at the time, well, the first thing I need to do is I need to identify who were the groups of people or individuals who were influenced or influenced by this proposed turning point. And you can see here that I identified the indigenous people as well as the English settlers. Now, for this model, there were only really two main groups. However, this definitely isn't always going to be the case. And you should make sure that you do this for all relevant groups, even if it is more than two. Next, we have Profundity, but I'm going to skip that one for now because that's the one that we're going to go through in much more depth in just a moment as a sample response. So after that, we have Quantity. And in addition to determining the number of indigenous people and English settlers impacted, you also might want to consider this first question, whether the number of people impacted across these two groups was equal, or if one group was impacted disproportionately. Fourth up is Durability, where you will actually look for the changes that affected the indigenous people and English settlers, and it may be useful to consider factors such as social, political, economic, and/or cultural ones as you go through this. Also, this is where you will factor in how long-lasting these changes were and whether they were temporary, long-lasting, or even in some cases permanent. And last is Relevance. Out of all these criteria, this one requires the most analysis. And you can see here that you want to consider such as connections that still exist to today's world, whether the displacement of indigenous people by English settlers connects to any enduring issues, civic issues, or other themes that you've seen before in history, and also how this event has shaped or influenced your acquisition of knowledge about the world. So let's go back to profundity, which is related to the word profound, meaning to have deep insight. And the way that it is used here is we're really looking to determine how deeply this event affected people. You can see that as we think about these things, we should consider how it affected the beliefs and attitudes of both the indigenous people and the English settlers. And when thinking about whether this was really deep or only superficial, it might also be useful to think about whether the changes you think of for these first two questions were temporary or short-term. Also, if you've been following these videos through the entire process, you can see the word land here, which is one of the defining characteristics we selected in step 3. So that is another little trick that you might want to use when you're doing this on your own. When I first read this question, I was thinking back to one of the texts that I read that mentioned something about the beliefs of the English settlers. And if I go back through the text that I annotated during an earlier step in the Turning Points tool, I ended up here in this source from Professor Greg Grandin. And he says down here that as Puritan society frayed under the harsh conditions of settler life, the frontier threatened and beckoned. This stuck out to me because of these two words, threatened and beckoned. Grandin here is describing how the frontier, or the border between the encroaching English settlers and the indigenous people, was both something for the English to fear, but also something that called to them. They sought land, resources, and some independence from the strict rules of their Puritan settlements, but going deeper into indigenous land and being more isolated also came with danger. Because of this, I do believe it is useful for me as I consider profundity, and this is the entry that I created. You can see here that it does include the quote, my analysis of the quote, as well as how it addresses the question of profundity, and yes, I do include at the end that I do believe it satisfies the criteria for whether or not this is a turning point. At this point, you should go ahead and complete the rest of this step, so feel free to pause this video while you do that. Once you are done, the next thing to do is to take a step back and really think about your findings about how historically significant this event is. There's a good chance that some of them may satisfy the criteria while others do not. That's why this next part is so important, and I'm going to pull it up here in the paper version so you can see it better. In this overall assessment area, summarize the evidence suggesting that it is and that it is not historically significant, and then make your ultimate decision down here below. But remember, to be a turning point, only being historically significant isn't enough. We also have to determine if change is greater than the continuity. For this, head back up to step 3 and review your findings in both spots here. After doing this, you'll have to use your judgment and weigh the conclusions you came to in both steps 3 and 4 as you reach your conclusion and construct your final evaluation down here in step 5. Let me end with some advice on how to write this last step. First, clearly state your claim. Then elaborate on your findings. Make certain you definitively prove that both criteria are met, and bring up specific relevant examples proving each. Here are some sentence starters you might want to consider using. In addition to informing your reader of not only the strong evidence justifying your decision, also you might want to include where the evidence leaves things a little uncertain and why you ultimately made the determination you did. As you've seen, being able to evaluate an event as a turning point is a very involved process. So when you're writing this up, show off all your hard work and the insight that you've gained.